Before the main talk, I'm going to plant a little seed. Suppose we can have a very fast cryptocurrency that confirms transactions under a second. So let's call this cryptocurrency Thunder tokens. OK. Suppose we can have an extremely fast cryptocurrency like this. What kind of applications do you want to build on top of it? You may keep this question on your mind throughout the rest of the talk. OK. So in today's talk, I'm going to describe the core consensus protocol that might enable such an extremely fast cryptocurrency. The protocol is called Thunderella. And this is joint work with Rafael Paz. So to clarify what this talk is about and what it isn't about, right? Like I said, the talk is about the core consensus protocol that enables an extremely fast cryptocurrency. I'm going to try to go a little slowly, and this, if you are not familiar with distributed consensus, don't worry. This is also meant to be like somewhat of a crash course on consensus. And it takes a lot more than just the consensus protocol to build a cryptocurrency, right? You know, we have to make the incentives all aligned. We have to design the governance policy. And in the interest of time, I won't be able to cover these topics in this talk. But we do have other works that address these other issues. OK, so let's get started. Earlier in May this year, British Airways had an outage. Like on this one day, all the flights out of London were canceled. And this is what the airport looked like. And this was because of a systems failure. And surprisingly, you know, something very, very similar happened to Delta Airlines in September last year. On this one day, they had a system outage. All the flights were canceled. You couldn't book any flights. And they lost $100 million US in revenue. What's the moral of these stories? We need replication and robustness in our systems, right? So this is a very, very simple idea. But it is precisely this very simple idea that gave birth to 30 years of research and development on distributed consensus. And in distributed systems, we care about a very important central abstraction called state machine replication. So what is state machine replication? It's the task of agreeing on a linearly ordered log over time. Imagine we have a set of servers. In this case, we have Google Wallet servers, right? Google Wallet doesn't want the kind of disaster that Delta Airlines had. And these servers want to agree on an ever-growing, linearly ordered log of transactions. OK, so there are two very important security requirements, namely consistency and liveness. Consistency says that all the honest nodes must agree on the log. Right? So because the network may have delay, it could be that Salil's log is a little faster than mine. Nonetheless, our logs need to be prefixes of each other at any point of time. OK, so liveness says whenever a client submits a transaction, all the honest nodes logs should include the transaction very soon. Right? So you don't want to go buy a coffee and have to wait for an hour for your coffee. OK, in the rest of the talk, whenever I mention consensus, I specifically refer to state machine replication. So this is the abstraction we care about in the rest of the talk. Any questions at this point? You're welcome to interrupt me at any point. OK. OK, so one thing that I wanted to mention at this point, right? So it seems like this task is like almost deceptively simple, right? So what is hard about building a linearly ordered log? Indeed, if all these servers are honest, this task is indeed trivial. But the interesting problem arises when some of these servers can be, for instance, compromised, right, due to malware. And these subset of compromised servers can, let's say, behave arbitrarily, deviate arbitrarily from the protocol. And yet, we still want the remaining honest nodes to agree on the log. OK. So actually, state machine replication has had a huge real-world impact, right? In fact, every Silicon Valley company deploys like some instances of state machine replication to replicate their computing infrastructure. Like for instance, for Google, they have this Chubby service, which is built on top of Paxos. Right? Paxos is a crash fault tolerant version of state machine replication protocol. And obviously, whatever Google does, you know, all the other Silicon Valley companies will copy. And that's why we have Apache Zookeeper. This is kind of, roughly speaking, the open source version of Google's Chubby. And pretty much every other Silicon Valley company deploys Apache Zookeeper. OK, so traditionally, when we talk about distributed consensus, the kind of scenario that conjures up in our mind is exactly what I talked about. There is a single organization like Google or Facebook. We have maybe a dozen nodes. And these nodes are interconnected with fast local area network. OK. But like maybe 9 years ago, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin came around. And this completely changed the way we think about distributed consensus. For the first time, these cryptocurrencies proved that consensus is actually possible on a large scale over the internet. OK, so this created a lot of excitement. And for instance, now, all of these banks across the world, right, they want to borrow this idea to build like a distributed ledger among all these banks. So this is also called a consortium blockchain. I've been talking to like banks in China who are interested in deploying consortium blockchain, and they're looking at a distributed ledger, for instance, among 100 banks. And for instance, if each bank has 10 nodes, you are easily looking at 1,000 node scale. OK. And that's why like all these companies and industry consortia in the space, everyone's rushing to create the next generation dream large-scale distributed consensus protocol. OK, so all of this is very exciting. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, it kind of doesn't make any sense, right? Because distributed consensus is like something like crypto that's very tricky to implement. But why is everyone rolling their own scheme and implementation? Why can't we have, let's say, the map produced for large-scale distributed consensus? To understand this question, let's look at the consensus landscape. I'm going to view things as classical versus blockchains, right? So for classical consensus protocols, I mean protocols like PBFT and Paxos. These protocols, for the most of the time, they're relatively fast. They confirm transactions in constant number of rounds. But on the other hand, these protocols are very complicated, to the extent that it's difficult to implement, to do security audit, and for operational maintenance. There are other issues with classical style consensus. For instance, they're not suitable in the permissionless setting, which is a point I will revisit later in the talk. We actually now mathematically understand why classical consensus protocols do not achieve the kind of robustness properties we want in large-scale settings. OK, we can also employ blockchain-style consensus, right? And the most representative protocol is Nakamoto's blockchain. And that is the protocol at the core of Bitcoin. So obviously, when we talk about, the interesting thing is like for blockchains, first they had a lot of empirical success, and then the kind of the academic community caught up, and then we now actually understand the mathematics behind these blockchain-style protocols. Due to these amazing works by Gray et al. And Pass et al., we kind of now understand that from a mathematical perspective, blockchains reach consensus through a fundamentally different mechanism than classical style consensus. So this is amazing because it kind of shows that Bitcoin is not just like an empirical success. It's also a theoretical breakthrough. OK. And of course, the first criticism you may have on your mind for blockchains is that they're extremely wasteful, right? So for instance, Bitcoin is consuming maybe more electricity than the total electricity consumption of Iceland. And this is for confirming like 3 transactions per second. OK. That doesn't seem very scalable. However, in order to make progress in this talk, I'm going to ask you to take a leap of faith and assume that we already know how to solve the proof of work problem. So if you want to know how to do this, we have a paper in AsiaCrypt this year called Sleepy Consensus, where we show how to basically remove the proof of work from blockchain-style protocols and still be able to emulate the mathematics behind Nakamoto's blockchain. OK. So for the rest of the talk, whenever I mention blockchains, I kind of include both proof of work blockchains and non-proof of work blockchains. So what do we know about blockchains, right? Empirically, it has had a lot of success. In other words, we know that these protocols are indeed very robust on a large scale. And partly the robustness comes from the protocol simplicity, right? So Bitcoin's protocol is extremely simple. Essentially, everyone picks the longest chain and tries to mine off the longest chain. And that's basically the two sentences that capture the protocol rules. There is, however, a big drawback. That is, the protocols are very slow, right? So as we know, Bitcoin confirms transactions taking at least 10 minutes per block. And usually you want to wait for like 6 to 10 blocks to get enough confidence. And that's kind of like an hour. And some of this slowness is actually inherent, right? So due to this very excellent work by Pass et al., right? They show that you have to set the block interval to be like 60 times the maximum hour delay in order to resist like a 49% attack. So some of the slowness is actually inherent. OK. So to quickly recap, I guess what I've expressed at this point is that, there is this landscape, but it seems like this dream protocol for large scale is still eluding us. And that's what I'm going to try to address in the rest of the talk. OK. And the plan is I'm going to start describing how to reach consensus, like in a classical approach. And I'm just going to talk about it until I get stuck. And when we get stuck, we are going to kind of try to combine the best of both worlds and see what we get. OK, so let's waste no time and see how to reach consensus. So we have Adam versus the superheroes. Adam's superpower is crypto and differential privacy. OK, so in this picture, Adam is the leader, and everyone else are the voters. OK, so some of these voters may be corrupt. Let's say in this case, Loki is corrupt. And of course, the leader can also be corrupt. OK, so here is a very, very simple voting protocol. And here's how it works. First, the leader, in this case Adam, is going to make a proposal. The proposal contains the sequence number and the transaction. OK, the sequence number is going to determine where in this log the transaction will appear. And for the time being, I'm just going to focus on one sequence number. But when you actually run the state machine replication protocol, there are many instances of this little voting protocol, one for each sequence number. OK. Once Adam makes the proposal, everyone's going to vote based on the leader's proposal, right? If I'm honest, I'm going to vote exactly what I hear from the leader. And in this case, it's a golden transaction, right? If I cast a golden vote here, it's voting according to Adam's proposal. On the other hand, if I'm corrupt, let's say like Loki is, he's voting for a red transaction and a blue transaction. OK, the important thing to remember, OK, so number 3, we are just going to wait till we collect enough votes on the same transaction, and then we are going to output that transaction. So very simple voting protocol. OK. The important thing to remember is that honest nodes are going to vote uniquely. If I'm honest, I will vote on the first proposal I hear from Adam, and I'm not going to vote for anything else, right? So when I vote, I mean I can basically sign the proposal from Adam. However, corrupt nodes can behave arbitrarily. They can cast votes for many different transactions. OK. So now let's kind of analyze the properties of this very simple voting protocol and see what we can get. And in this example, I'm going to assume that n is equal to 3f plus 1, where n is the total number of nodes, and f is the number of corrupt nodes. So this is assuming that at most, less than 1/3 of the people can be corrupt. OK, so in this case, I claim I have to count 2f plus 1 people voting for the same transaction in order to confirm it. OK. And so why is this the case? Imagine, in this case, Spider-Man hears 2f plus 1 people voting for the red transaction, and Iron Man hears 2f plus 1 people voting for the golden transaction. And I'm going to call this the red quorum and the orange quorum. And it is not difficult to see that these two quorums must intersect at least one honest node, right? Given the parameters n equal to 3f plus 1. So this is just by simple pigeonhole principle. And remember that I said the most important thing to remember about this protocol is that honest nodes vote uniquely. And in this case, if Spider-Man outputs the red transaction and Iron Man outputs the orange, it must be the case that the red is equal to the orange, because this honest guy in the middle cannot vote inconsistently. So this is like essentially a consistency proof, right? And then if you think about the proof a little more carefully, the proof doesn't rely on the fact that the leader must be honest. Like the proof only relies on the fact that honest nodes are going to vote uniquely, no matter what Adam does. OK, so therefore we can think of this very simple voting protocol in these two different worlds, right? On the left-hand side, we have a very nice world where Adam is honest. And in this case, we can achieve both consistency and liveness, right? I argued about consistency. For liveness, it's not difficult to see, because if Adam is honest, he's going to propose the same transaction to all the honest nodes. And soon enough, I'm going to hear all the honest nodes vote, right? And then I'll collect enough votes to output. On the other hand, if Adam is malicious, we still have consistency, like I said. The consistency argument doesn't rely on the leader being honest. However, we don't have liveness, right? Because Adam can propose different transactions to different nodes. And now everyone's going to vote differently. And it could be the case that you never hear enough people vote for the same transaction. OK. So therefore, the crux of the problem so far seems to be how to fix this liveness issue, right, when, let's say, the leader is corrupt. OK. So this is where all of these classical protocols get incredibly complicated. And I don't want to have to explain this. So in summary, if you look at a lot of these classical consensus protocols like PBFT, Paxos, many different variants, they kind of all share the same kind of anatomy. That is, they have a very simple normal path. It's basically voting-based, right? I talked about a single round of voting. Usually, these protocols need to do multiple rounds of voting to actually get ready for this recovery path. So this recovery path is to deal with the issue that when the leader is corrupt, there is no liveness. And then, therefore, you have to find some mechanism to re-elect leader in that case. Like in PBFT, this is called a view change.
So to understand what's going on, so the issue with the simple, one of the issues with the simple protocol is that not all the honest people will see exactly, like if the leader's not, not only, like if the leader's not honest, not only could it be the case that they never agree on anything, but it could be that, like, I think we've agreed, but you don't think we, right? There's a different issue. Which
right, that's a slightly, it could be that you have confirmed something, but I have not.
Right. So that requires like an additional round of, right? Like that's in these classical consensus protocols, that's part of what adds to the round complexity is making sure we all have
so I think it depends on the model. I think in this case, like if I have confirmed something, I can always produce like a proof showing like the votes that I've collected and convince you to output that thing too. Right. So it depends on the model, like whether you have PKI, whether it's like synchrony versus asynchrony. So in this specific example, I think like.
It's not an issue.
Okay. So interestingly, right, so what does this complexity mean in practice? So there is this company based in San Francisco. It's called Chain.com. They signed this like high-profile contract with Visa to deploy blockchains for Visa. And the way their consensus protocol works is that they basically implement only the normal path. There's only the voting. And this means when things go bad, they have to do all of this stuff manually, right? This recovery stuff manually. And think about doing it among 100 banks and how painful that might have been. Okay. So so now we are going to try to fix this problem by combining both classical and blockchains. And our idea is very simple. We are going to basically ditch this complicated stuff and replace it with a very simple blockchain. And our protocol is called Thunderella. OK, so I'm going to explain how to actually make this idea work. And before that, I'm going to describe the kind of properties that we can hope to achieve with this approach. OK, so fundamentally, we are a blockchain-style protocol, right? So this means that we can be just as simple and as robust as blockchains are. 95% of the time, we are going to be in the fast path, also called the optimistic path. And in the fast path, we can confirm transactions in 2 to 3 actual network rounds, so very fast. Even when we are under attack, let's say the leader is not there, the committee is offline, it's not the end of the world. Because in the worst case, we just fall back to the blockchain's guarantees, and we have the blockchain's performance. So that's kind of the high-level goal. The Thunderella works for both permissionless and permissioned, but when I talk about the protocol for concreteness, I'm going to assume the permissionless setting. Right? I'll very quickly mention about permissioned setting towards the end. And more concretely, I'm going to assume the following scenario, and this is actually what Ethereum wants to do. Ethereum is the second largest cryptocurrency right next to Bitcoin. OK, so in Ethereum, we know that today they have a proof-of-work blockchain. They want to eventually switch to a proof-of-stake blockchain, but it doesn't matter. We use blockchain as a black box. OK, so they want to say, on top of the blockchain, let's elect a committee, right? So for instance, we can elect stakeholders as the committee. We can also randomly elect some of the miners as the committee. And they want the committee to kind of vote on the blocks, maybe hopefully to achieve faster confirmation, and so on. OK, I'm going to ask you to assume that there is a mechanism to elect the committee and perhaps rotate the committee over time, and similarly for the leader. So there's some kind of pre-agreed upon mechanism to elect the leader and the committee. I'm not going to focus on the specific mechanism to achieve that, but I'm going to talk about the consensus protocol, assuming that the leader and the committee can be elected. OK. This is the kind of assumption we have to make to get the worst case guarantees. We are going to assume that the miners of the blockchain are majority honest. In the case that this is proof-of-work blockchain, it means the majority of the compute power is honest. If it's proof-of-stake blockchain, it means the majority of the stake is honest. For the committee, we are going to assume majority of the committee are honest. However, to get our worst case guarantees, the honest people don't actually have to be online. It's actually perfectly OK if they just drop offline. And the worst thing that can happen is we fall back to the slow path. OK. So I'm going to try to skip this straw man example to maybe try to keep time. So how would our protocol work? OK. So recall I described this very simple voting protocol earlier, right? I'm going to very quickly recap the protocol, but now keeping in mind that there are multiple instances of this little voting protocol for various different sequence numbers. So basically, the leader, Adam, makes a proposal. Everyone votes. And at this point, let's say I observe that transactions 1, 2, and 3 have collected enough votes. I'm going to call these transactions notarized. I haven't observed sequence number 4 collecting enough votes. So 4 has not been notarized. And then 5 and 6 have been notarized. So in this case, I want that at least 3/4 of the committee have voted to call it notarized. So this is because I'm targeting any minority corruption. Right? Earlier, I gave a 1/3 example. But if you want to tolerate minority corruption, you have to set the parameter to 3/4. OK. So we have to process the transaction one by one in a linear order, because otherwise, it can be double spending. In this case, I can only confirm the first 3 transactions. I can only process the first 3 transactions. I cannot process 4 yet. I cannot process 5 yet, although 5 has already been notarized. So for the lack of a better term, I'm going to call this the maximal lucky sequence. Right? The maximal lucky sequence is starting from the very beginning, how many transactions have been notarized with non-skipping sequence numbers. OK. So the main issue we need to fix is, let's say, if Adam is corrupt, or maybe if the committee, they're all offline. They're all sleeping and having a nice summer vacation. So now we have to try to see how to get liveness out of it. And here's where the blockchain comes in. We are going to use the blockchain for 2 purposes. And the first purpose is to collect evidence to detect when things go wrong. I want to, when the fast path fails, I want to be able to make everyone agree, OK, now the fast path has failed, and we want to maybe do a view change. OK, so once we detect something has gone wrong, we will leverage the blockchain to enter slow mode, which is this blockchain slow path. And once you are in the slow path, you can always try to re-elect leader and maybe try to be back in the fast path again with a new leader. Maybe Salil will be the new leader if Adam is bad. OK. So I'm going to talk about how to achieve these 2, starting with how to detect. OK. So we need a detection mechanism that's kind of robust. In other words, the corrupt nodes cannot falsely accuse a good leader, because otherwise it can cause denial of service attack. OK. And here's a very simple mechanism to do this detection. I'm going to assume, so normally when we have a blockchain, right, we use the blockchain to confirm transactions. I'm going to ask you to think of the blockchain slightly differently. That is, when people mine a block, they're going to tell the blockchain, they're going to incorporate in the block they mine everything they have seen so far in the protocol. So this is a conceptual protocol. Like when you actually implement it, you don't have to do this. But for simplicity of explanation, let's imagine whenever I mine a block, I'm going to tell the blockchain everything I've seen. OK, so suppose at some point, again, these transactions with sequence numbers have been notarized. Those without have not been notarized. So suppose at some point, I notice that in this block, there is a red transaction that's unnotarized. So normally, if the leader were honest and online, right, the leader would have seen this unnotarized transaction, and he's supposed to propose it very quickly. And if everything's good and the fast path is indeed working, it should be the case that in roughly security parameter number of blocks, this red unauthorized transaction should become part of a lucky sequence. It should have been confirmed in the fast path. And if this has not happened, then the only explanation is, maybe the leader is trying to censor this transaction, or maybe the committee are not online and available to vote. So in either case, the fast path has failed, and we want to kind of go back to the slow mode and maybe try to re-elect leader. OK. So any questions about this? Very simple, right? OK, so now let's say we all detect fast path has failed. How can we go back to the blockchain slow path? It turns out it's actually slightly tricky to do this correctly. Although when I tell you the answer, you'll see that it's also very simple. OK, so what's the problem here? Now, everyone wants to enter the slow path. However, the fast path lock we have may be slightly different. Right? By consistency of the fast path, your lock has to be a prefix of mine. But it doesn't mean we are at the same length. Your lock can be a little faster than mine. And when we switch back to the blockchain mode, we have to define a cutoff. Like everyone has to agree on this cutoff. And that's the problem we are trying to solve. again, it may seem like a very deceptively simple problem, right? You may have some kind of ideas on your mind how to solve it. But the first thing to notice is that this actually is an agreement problem in itself. And unlike the fast path where we cheated and said we only care about consistency but not liveness, here we have to solve this agreement problem in 4. We need both consistency and liveness. And how do we do it? Again, the blockchain is your friend, right? The blockchain is this underlying thing that gives you both consistency and liveness. OK, so the idea is to introduce what's called a grace period. It's essentially consists of security parameter number of blocks. It's a cooldown period. And I'm going to say, if we all want to go to slow mode, and we don't do it immediately, we are going to first cool down and then go to slow mode. And how do we use this grace period? OK, so now say we all want to go to slow mode. The first thing we do is we stop participating in the fast path. And then we are just going to tell each other, OK, here's what I know of the fast path lock. And when people mine blocks, remember they're going to tell the blockchain what they know, right? So if you continue doing this for kappa mod blocks, where kappa is a security parameter, at the end, the kind of guarantee you can achieve is the following. So suppose I look at the prefix of the blockchain up to the end of the grace period, and I ask, what is the maximal lucky sequence contained in the prefix so far? I claim that this maximum lucky sequence contained in the blockchain has to be at least as long as anyone's fast path lock. And this is the maximal lucky sequence we are going to agree on to be the cutoff before we enter slow mode. OK, so that basically summarizes the main idea behind the protocol. We use the blockchain for 2 purposes. First, to detect when the fast path has failed, and second, to enter the slow mode in a way that preserves the security, the consistency of the protocol. OK, and once you are in the slow mode, of course, you don't want to be slow forever. You can now re-elect leader. OK, just to revisit the guarantees we can achieve, assuming the miners are majority honest and the committee are majority honest, we can always hope for the worst case guarantees. However, when life is good, let's say, imagine in real life, maybe at least 3/4 of the committee are not only honest, but also online. And moreover, the leader is also honest and online. And in these situations, we can confirm very, very fast. OK, and in fact, this is actually just a side note. This parameter you can play around with, right? So suppose I'm very paranoid, and I don't want to trust that the majority of the committee are honest. Let's say I want that the protocol retains security as long as a single member of the committee is honest. And this member doesn't even have to be online. And that is also perfectly OK. But in this case, we have a more stringent condition for the optimistic path. Like we would have to require all the committee members to be honest and online to be in this fast path. OK, another interesting thing to note, it should already be obvious, is that the worst case guarantees, this is the worst case guarantee. The worst case guarantees doesn't rely on the leader being honest, which is to say, like in a system like Thunderella, the leader is more of an acceleration service. Even if the acceleration service is like corrupt or has an outage, it doesn't matter. The worst thing that can happen is that you are going to do things more slowly. OK. OK, so now I want to recap the protocol. And I want to talk about some of the deeper insights we gained, and then I'll wrap up. OK, so the protocol can be summarized in 2 sentences. When things are good, you use the single round of voting to confirm transactions. And when things go bad, you just use the blockchain to do a view change. So that is all you need to remember from this talk. OK. Well, of course, like in our paper, we have a lot more details. We have optimizations that I didn't cover. We talk about how to implement all these policy, right, and how to re-elect committee, proofs of security. I focused on the permissionless setting. Thunderella obviously also works for permissioned, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. Instead, before I conclude, I want to talk about some of the deeper insights we've gained in this process, and why, for instance, there's 30 years of work in this space, why we can claim to be like a lot simpler and faster than everyone else. And I want to convince you that Thunderella is a new theoretical paradigm. OK. If you look at all these classical protocols like PBFT and Paxos, they're in the asynchronous model, or maybe partially synchronous model. In the asynchronous or partially synchronous model, the protocol doesn't know an upper bound on the message delivery time. And this makes life hard when you design the protocol, because you cannot have a protocol instruction that says, I'm going to wait for some timeout, and if the message didn't arrive, I can assume it's not going to arrive. OK. But in some sense, we baited and switched, and we are actually using an asynchronous protocol underneath. So note that here, I'm also claiming that blockchains are synchronous. And in fact, actually, for no reason do we have to be stuck with blockchain. We can actually use any synchronous protocol underneath. So why are blockchains synchronous? There are two ways to think about it. One is that due to the work by Pass et al., we understand that the block interval must be something like 60 times larger than the maximum network delay to resist 49% attack, right? So there is this a priori set synchrony parameter. But perhaps more fundamentally, in a paper joint with Raphael, we show that in the permissionless setting, where you are not sure how many nodes are going to show up a priori, in fact, asynchrony is basically impossible. You can't hope to have a consensus protocol assuming network asynchrony. So now we can look at the world from this perspective. There's asynchrony and there's synchrony. And these classical protocols live in this corner. They're very fast, obviously, because if the protocol doesn't even know the upper bound on the network's delay, the only conceivable way for the protocol to work is to take actions whenever I receive messages, right? So therefore, the protocol has to move as fast as messages are delivered. You don't have to wait for any synchrony delay. On the other hand, if you want to work with asynchrony, it's going to be problematic in many ways. Not only are these protocols complex, more fundamentally, there are inherent barriers for large scale. Or not necessarily even for large scale. Like, for instance, due to this very well-known work by Dwork et al., they show that any asynchronous protocol cannot tolerate 1/3 corruptions or more. And what's perhaps even more alarming is that, like I said, if you want permissionless, then under certain conditions, asynchrony is just simply not possible. OK. It's also interesting, right? So classically, we kind of believe that synchronous protocols are slow. And if you look at the systems literature, you look at all these SOSP papers, most protocols do work. The protocols that people implement in practice are almost always asynchronous protocols. And partly, this is because if you have a synchronous protocol, even if the protocol waited for a single synchrony parameter, it may already be unacceptable, right? Because the synchrony parameter is security critical. If your average network delay is 1 millisecond, you might want to set the synchrony parameter to be 100 milliseconds, because if the synchrony assumption is violated, then you don't have anything whatsoever. And in this classical deployment scenario like Google and Facebook, they want microsecond latency. So that's why it rules out these synchronous protocols. But what we show is that maybe this insight is actually incorrect, right? We can both be synchronous fundamentally and still be fast at the same time, 95% of the time in practice. So if you look at where Thunderella lives, it's in this very interesting corner, right? So 95% of the time, we are in the asynchronous world. And when things go bad, we fall back to this very robust synchronous protocol. OK. And this gets us like new theoretical properties. For instance, if you want asynchrony, like I said, you cannot hope to tolerate more than 1/3 corruptions. We are not bound to this barrier, right? We can tolerate, let's say, a half in a permissionless setting. And in the classical setting, we can even tolerate, for instance, n-1 faults if you use something like Dolef-Strong to realize the underlying synchronous protocol. Okay. So we are very excited about this, and we are working on developing this protocol and trying to commercialize it. Before I conclude, I want to emphasize that one very nice thing about the protocol is that it's extremely simple, and this is going to go a very long way, especially in large scale. Okay. And I have a Google form, like if you have interesting applications to suggest for this very fast cryptocurrency, name your favorite smart contract to implement on top of this very fast cryptocurrency, you can go to this Google form. Thank you very much.
We're almost back on time, on
okay,
schedule,
great.
But since it would seem to be a shame to be too timely, right? We've got time for questions. Yeah,
Celia.
So, any thoughts on why blockchains have taken off so much despite the slowness?
That's a very good question. I guess a lot of it is also speculation. Despite the slowness, yes. Also, I think like for these cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, right now there aren't actually so many transactions that need to be confirmed. Like the usage still hasn't quite picked up so much, and a lot of maybe the wallet and the tokens are held by people maybe like speculators and stuff. But like I had a paper back in 2011. This was actually the first academic paper on Bitcoin. Like I was very intrigued by Bitcoin back then, and I tried to kind of, with my co-authors, we tried to reason why Bitcoin's design was like incentive compatible. Like there are many elements of it, like the fact that it encourages early adoption. For this mining thing, like you get rewards for the block you mine and the transaction fees you collect. So I think a lot of it has to do with like this incentive alignment.
Any other questions for Elaine? Yeah. At some point you said that the member committee submits and commits on a block what they know so far. What can you elaborate on that? What does it mean for the spare requirements of the whole blockchain?
So actually, like this is not how you would actually implement it in practice. Like when you implement it in practice, you don't want this blockchain to. Let's go back to the slide. So when I talked about it, I was kind of saying the blockchain is going to collect every node's view in the protocol so far, right? So the blockchain is like some kind of catch-all thing, but that's going to be bandwidth expensive in practice. When you actually implement it, you want to say the blockchain collects only hashes of the fast path that has been confirmed so far. There are certain, it's not too difficult to like optimize the protocol, so the blockchain is actually rather thin. Is that your question?
But what about the space requirements? Because we know Bitcoin has a problem with blockchain grows too large. So is there any improvement on the space requirements in your protocol?
So someone has to like store all these transactions, right? I guess the point is that maybe if you are not a full-fledged miner, or if you are only a client, whether there is like a method for you to only store maybe only the transactions you care about. So that's one interesting question to consider in practice. Also, another approach people have looked at is sharding. Sharding is like some way to maybe divide up the transaction address space. So each shard kind of confirms only transactions belonging to this address space. And then, of course, you have to deal with cross-shard transactions. Cross-shard transactions have to be handled by both shards. So like Bitcoin has this SVP client, for instance, like where if I'm willing to delegate the trust to a server, I can just have the server tell me whether I should accept the transaction or not. But this like is achieving the space saving in a way that maybe weakens the trust model. It would be interesting maybe to have like a different approach where you don't have to weaken the trust and still be able to like save on the space. Right. Okay.
Thank Elaine. Yeah.